Hey everybody, this is going to be the introduction to the final assignment for Comm skills, which will be our SketchUp modeling assignment. So we spent most of our time thus far in Rhino. However, this will be using SketchUp. The software has a few advantages and disadvantages to Rhino, and some strengths and weaknesses that we'll go over. I think in the sort of professional world, SketchUp is a pretty commonly used software in architecture and interior design. Some of its benefits are that it's relatively simple to use, so much so that in my firm, we often will actually send our clients SketchUp models, and because there's a free version available, clients are actually able to open models and typically even sort of orbit around and look at things. You couldn't exactly do the same thing with Rhino. It's usually a bit too complicated. You'll often find also that at a lot of firms that have, say, senior partners or people who've been with the firm a lot longer who may not necessarily have gotten their education on computers, but started on hand drafting. Even these people will often be SketchUp users, or at least able to open a software and fiddle around in it. Having said that, its simplicity can also be a weakness at times. The type of geometry that SketchUp uses is sort of unique to SketchUp, but is most closely related to a sort of mesh modeling process. And because of that, it's good to be careful and develop good modeling practices. Otherwise, you could end up creating a model that maybe works for the time being, but wouldn't allow you to iterate on it, and certainly wouldn't allow anyone else to open up the model and continue working on it. So there's a few things that we can do in the modeling process as sort of just best practice that will allow these models to be as useful as possible and be as flexible as possible into the future. So having come from Rhino, there are going to be quite a few differences. SketchUp is not a command line software, meaning you do not type in the name of commands. It is primarily a keystroke software. So basically, every command that exists in SketchUp can be bound to a key on your keyboard, and you can customize these to your heart's content. I will share with you my SketchUp preferences that I've used. Essentially, I've remapped, for my own purposes, every function in SketchUp to a different key on the keyboard. And the reason being, and I'll show you this on the next page, but essentially, the default layout has you using keys all the way across the keyboard, which, although may make sense with the naming, the move key, for example, is M, push-pull is the P key. However, I find it much faster if you can concentrate your keys that you're going to end up using all to one side. So I've based my keyboard setup based on what you would use in, say, a video game, where W, A, S, and D are the typical keys you use for moving around in a video game. The same principle works very well for SketchUp. Essentially, it allows you to keep your arms fairly straight out. You're using the left side of the keyboard, and you can pretty much access every control that exists in SketchUp without really having to move your hand across the keyboard, and just makes you a little bit faster. Of course, you're welcome to use the default keys or set your own, and whatever you like. So some of the differences are, essentially, you are always modeling planar surfaces in this. There is no such thing as a curved surface in SketchUp. There are just surfaces that are faceted enough so that they look curved, which does tend to sort of lean SketchUp more towards making orthogonal or rectangular geometry. However, if you are aware of this sort of limitation, you can work around it and sort of use SketchUp for what it's good at, and also use other tools like Rhino for more your curvilinear amorphic geometry. For this assignment, what I'd like everyone to do is take one of the schemes that you've been developing in Studio and essentially bring it into SketchUp, where the majority of your model can remain as sort of a massing model, so just kind of boxes. And then one particular piece of program I'd like you to detail out as a sort of further iteration that you'll be doing in skills. For those of you who are taking the skills course and not studio, I'll just ask that you sort of make a very basic massing on site and then create something similar to what you see on the screen here, and I'll go over in more detail in the demo. But basically just kind of come up with a sort of massing scheme and come up with a couple elements that you can iterate on in SketchUp. In general, we're not going to be looking necessarily at your design per se. We're going to be looking whether or not you've used the tools of SketchUp and your sort of the way you've put your modeling process together. I'd also like you to add in a few pieces of furniture that can be found through the SketchUp warehouse, which I'll cover. Essentially, the SketchUp warehouse, or the 3 warehouse, is a repository of assets such as furniture, vegetation, cars, people, anything you can think of, even buildings, that anyone can upload online. So people will upload their own models, but also companies will upload their own products. So if you're speccing a particular chair, you can go and find that chair that the company has uploaded, so you'll know exactly what it looks like in your space. But it's essentially one of the largest collections of 3D models that exists, all of which add into your model very easily. There are a few things to be aware of when you're doing it. Some of these models, because they're made by anyone in the world, could be either not particularly modeled well or given a huge amount of geometric complexity, which could slow down your model in general. So as a rule of thumb, I always suggest opening things you download from 3D Warehouse in a separate model, assessing them for their quality, removing textures and things that you may not need before you bring them into your actual model. Again, just for the sake of not overloading a model so it starts to slow down. When modeling in SketchUp, it is always a good idea to be modeling in groups and components. So this is going to be similar to groups in Rhino, or what you might think of as solids sometimes, and components are going to be similar to blocks. Essentially, when you're modeling, you never want to have loose lines or loose surfaces that aren't somehow grouped together into one group. It's just kind of a different way that you have to work, but if you follow this sort of principle, and again, I'll show this in the demo, it allows the model to remain flexible and iteratable, if that's a word, much longer than if you have everything loose. And it's very difficult to manage making changes later on if you haven't modeled this way. So SketchUp does have a layer management system that's also referred to as tags. I believe in SketchUp 2020 and beyond, they've changed the name from layers to tags. Layers are not exactly the same as what you'd use in Rhino or Photoshop or anything else. They're more best thought of as a way to organize groups and components. However, it's always best practice when creating geometry that the geometry itself, the lines, the surfaces, etc., are always done on the base layer, layer 0, and the groups that contain them can be shifted from layer to layer, but everything inside those groups should always be on layer 0. Again, this is sort of an eccentricity of SketchUp, just a good practice to keep up with and follow. From SketchUp, we're going to export a series of images. So you see 3 of those examples in this image here. Essentially the line work straight out of it, the shadows by themselves, some tones by themselves, and then ultimately take this into Photoshop and make a composition out of this, adding in at least 3 people. At the end, I'd like you to create a single multi-page 11 by 17 PDF that has your final image, and then the 4 layers that I've asked you to export as separate images as part of that PDF. Those layers are going to be a line layer, a shadow layer, an X-ray layer, and a tone layer. All of which you can export straight from SketchUp at 5,000 pixels wide. Whatever the height is, just let it autofill in based on your screen size. And again, I'll go over how to do that. So on this next page here, I have a few options and some things to recommend. So first, there are various ways in which you can download and install SketchUp. There are 2 very good free options. The first is actually not using the current version of SketchUp, but using SketchUp Make 2017. Beyond the year 2017, SketchUp, the free version, became a web-based app. So it's something that you would use through Chrome or Explorer, whatever, Safari, whatever web app that you use. However, in that transition, I feel some of the functionality has been taken away, and it's not quite as useful of a software as it used to be. So if you're going to go purely the free route, I'd recommend downloading SketchUp Make 2017, which is still available. Just make sure you're getting the Make version, not the Pro version, as those are, they will give you a trial, a limited time trial. This is available for both Mac and PC, and the software is essentially identical between the two. So in this case, you really can't go wrong with one versus the other. Do whichever you prefer to use. There is a paid/trial version that you can also use. So the free version of SketchUp, no matter which of the options you take, the web or the 2017, are still limited in some functionality, most specifically importing and exporting file types other than SketchUp. So if you want to work, say, between Rhino and SketchUp, you're often going to be transferring models between the two. And SketchUp Make will make that a bit easier for you, a bit more difficult for you. Whereas if you use SketchUp Pro, or as it's called now, SketchUp Studio, you're essentially able to import a lot of different file types that you otherwise wouldn't be able to, and export a lot of different file types. Most specifically, DWG and DXF, the sort of standard file types for CAD and three-dimensional geometry. That is a limit of the paid version. So if you are going to end up using SketchUp long-term, which I think a lot of you might end up doing, I definitely think getting the Pro version is worthwhile. And it costs $55 a year for students and educators, so the cost is pretty reasonable for software, that is. So I definitely recommend that as an option. There's also a 30-day free trial that you can use. So this could just be, if you just want to download the full version for this assignment, just get the free trial for now. Everything else should work fine. SketchUp, one of its strengths is also the extremely large and wide plugin community that exists. There are plugins that supplement and add in a lot of other functionality that SketchUp doesn't have by itself. I mentioned early on, SketchUp tends to work better with sort of orthogonal geometry and flat surfaces. A lot of the plugins allow you to sort of augment that and add in more functionality to do more curvilinear or abstract or say blobitecture design. So I've listed a few that I use on a regular basis that I find to be the most useful for me. The first is Scatter. Scatter is a software, and I'll actually pull up the links for these, which I already have open. But Scatter is this software here. It essentially allows you to distribute any sort of object on a surface or a curve. It's most commonly used for vegetation. So if you wanted to scatter, say, a bunch of trees on your model or a bunch of grass on your model, Scatter allows you to do that pretty easily and pretty effectively. So it's available for, I think, $5 per student for a year. So again, a pretty affordable option. The next I was going to mention, this is one of the more costly ones, but it's called Vertex Tools. And this essentially gives you a lot of more abstract modeling capabilities. And it's a very powerful tool especially if you want to do soft modeling, where you're sort of, softly manipulating a surface. It's a very powerful option. I have used it before and found it to work very well. Next, this is a free one, Round Corner. So all the links are on the assignment sheet, by the way. And essentially this allows you to create rounded corners on three-dimensional geometry, such as bevels and, the other one, I can't remember right now. Next is Cleanup. This is probably the most they're all very useful, but this is one of my most commonly used plugins, I should say, for SketchUp. Essentially, this is a extension of the purge command that already exists in SketchUp, but gives you a lot more capability to clean models. So this is especially important if you end up importing a lot of assets from the 3D warehouse. This allows you to go in and clean them of all kinds of extra stuff that might be in there, hidden things, make sure all the geometry is on the same layer, get rid of extra lines, materials, a bunch of things. It's a really useful software and can make your models run quicker, because you're not holding on to a bunch of extra information that isn't necessary. This one is free. However, you do have to install, there's an additional piece that you have to install. So I think it's the TT library. Just read through the instructions if you're going to get any of these. The last one that I'm going to mention is, so there are many more rendering engines available for SketchUp in general than there are for Rhino. So SketchUp tends to be a bit of a more widely used software in general, not just within architecture, but in other fields. So I'm only bringing up one of them. V-Ray actually exists for both SketchUp Mac and SketchUp PC, whereas on Rhino it only exists for the PC. This is the software that I actually use for most of my professional rendering, which is called Indigo. It is a fully non-biased rendering engine that I find to produce a really good quality rendering, but also sort of my time investment in getting, taking a sort of base model and getting it to the point where I can get a sort of really good output, I find to be the fastest of any software that I've used in the past, which is the biggest reason I'm a fan of this software. It is available for SketchUp and Blender and Revit and a few other things. And there is a student version. There is a trial, but the trial leaves a watermark. The student version is, I think, 145 euros. So it's not incredibly cheap, but it is a lifetime license. So if you end up getting this, you only have to pay for it once, unlike V-Ray or well, some of the other softwares that are a yearly license. So there is a bit of an advantage there and potentially a savings in the long term. So of the links I have, this is the SketchUp link for the older version. You want to make sure you're getting the Make 2017 if you end up going this route. Otherwise, you can try SketchUp or do the higher education and get the version for students. Again, I think this is definitely worth purchasing if you're going to end up using SketchUp long term. The pro functionality that it brings is definitely really useful, especially if you're working between softwares often. It's basically a necessity to have it. Okay, so I'm going to be distributing this model here, which is basically the site model that we've been working with in Rhino, brought into SketchUp and had a few things adjusted to it. So I've cleaned this up as much as possible, and I put a large plinth where our site is, mostly because our site isn't flat. So just to give everyone a sort of flat starting surface to work on. However, I expect you'll probably be manipulating this as part of your design. And then I have an example design here that I'm going to use in my demo, but basically to give you an idea of what I'm generally looking for. So you can see here the majority of this is kind of what I call massing model, just blocks, maybe a little bit of detail in places. And then I went in and designed and detailed out in more specificity one particular element. In this case, a sort of tectonic shading device that I'll show how I made and how that you can make that too. And I also have sort of a very basic construction sitting here with walls and a roof and a sort of glass curtain wall. This is kind of the level that I'm expecting you guys to get to. Again, most of the buildings are still blocks, but a couple pieces get more detailed. Specifically, I'd like you to create something that has repetition in it. And the reason being, we can use some of the sort of features of SketchUp, some of its strengths, to make something that's very flexible and easy to continue editing. So you can see here, I can start manipulating this design, and pretty quickly you can not just manipulate one piece, but manipulate many of them. In this case, this is using the component functionality that I mentioned before. And then I've brought in a couple pieces of furniture, as mentioned. These are just some lounge chairs that I found on the SketchUp warehouse. But basically, this is the sort of, oops, I got lost inside of a wall. That's something you'll find with SketchUp that happens fairly often. But this is the kind of level that I'm looking for. Now, you may want to focus on more of an interior space or an exterior space. Either is fine with me. I'd like to see something that uses this sort of repetitive geometry that I have here. And again, I think of this best as a sort of another mode that you can iterate on your studio project in. And again, for anyone who isn't currently taking studio, just some simple massings on the site will suffice and create maybe a simple enclosure of some sort. Again, as long as you're using the tools of SketchUp, that'll be fine with me. Okay, so that's going to be it for the introduction. I will be posting a video shortly on the demo. Thanks.